Hello there, welcome to saberduelgaming, where we always take the high ground. Now 1 year ago this month, I reviewed Super Mario Kart on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Following that, later on I did get around to reviewing Super Mario Kart 64, a game I found far more entertaining and enjoyable, even going back now. Now it's time to look at the Game Boy Advance's entry in this series, Mario Kart Super Circuit, our retro review. Released in 2001, Mario Kart Super Circuit was one of the flagship and most popular games for the Game Boy Advance. It was also the first ever portable version and third version overall of the Mario Kart franchise. And the Game Boy Advance in itself was a far cry and massive improvement from the original Game Boy and Game Boy Color. However, it still felt a fair bit behind the home consoles. The Game Boy Advance was effectively a more advanced, compact version of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, and a lot of the games really demonstrated that. Where Mario Kart Super Circuit really stood ahead of a lot of the other games released for the console is many of those games were effectively just ports for the SNES. The Super Mario Advance franchise was basically just versions of these Super Mario Bros. Games re-released with slightly different names. However, Mario Kart Super Circuit, whilst having many of the levels from the original Super Nintendo Mario Kart, was an entirely new game. However, it must be said that this game played very much like a slightly updated version of the Mario Kart for the Super Nintendo. And whilst that was a very successful game, time had moved on from then. As seen earlier, we'd already seen Mario Kart 64, which was a massive improvement on the original, and going back to this game, whilst very impressive for a handheld, was certainly a bit of a step back. However, as a handheld release game, this was still considered something very special. Either way, this game had everything you would have expected from a Mario Kart game at the time. The graphics were certainly an improvement over the SNES console itself, and it had many more levels, including levels from the original SNES release, as well as a whole host of new levels, many of which were especially quirky and ones that we've never seen before or since. There was a number of different options. Obviously the Grand Prix modes are there, and there's also options such as Battle Mode and Multiplayer. Pretty much everything the fans of the Mario Kart franchise would have expected and wanted. So, how was the game received? Well, on its release in 2001, it received universal acclaim across the board, with scores of the high 80s to low 90s in pretty much every area it was reviewed. Commercially, it was just as big as a success. It sold 5.91 million copies. Even to this date, it's still ranked the fourth most successfully selling Game Boy Advance game ever made, and to be clear, the other three games above it, they're all Pokemon games. And the Game Boy Advance, and especially in 2001, was especially Pokemon heavy, so for this to be the highest ranking game outside of that franchise is pretty impressive. In 2002, it won the Nickelodeon's Kids' Choice Award for Favourite Handheld Video Game, and it was nominated for a host of other awards also. The better than SNES quality visuals received a lot of praise for a handheld game. Whilst there was some awareness that the controls could be a little bit tetchy to start with, most agreed that this actually improved the more you played it and gave it some more longevity, so this was actually seen as a positive. But does it still stack up as well now? Well, let's take a look with some modern scrutiny. Well, the first thing to note in this is that whilst this game ranks especially highly even to this day in the list of Game Boy Advance games, it actually ranks one of the all-time lowest in Mario Kart games. This is partly to do with the fact that in a lot of ways Mario Kart 64 had moved on so dramatically from the SNES version of the game that even an improved version of the SNES game was miles behind. It was also probably the version of the game with the least amount of innovation. In many ways, going from step to step, this was a step back from the most recent version. The one thing it does add, however, that I will say I absolutely loved, was it was the first version of the game to include tracks from previous games, something which has become a common trend and tradition within Mario Kart games to date. And in its defense, Going back to play this game, whilst I certainly still found it less pick-up and playable than Mario Kart 64, it was certainly easier to get to grips with than Mario Kart on the SNES. I found that game very difficult to engage with going back, to the point where it often felt unplayable and awkward. This game doesn't really have that. Yes, some of these sharp turns and tracks can feel quite limiting and a little bit awkward. Overall though, the game is really quite fun to play, and the fact that it's designed for a handheld console makes it far more forgivable. It's certainly a good type of game to put on a handheld. Race by race, lap by lap, you can fit it into short periods of time, and that has to be factored in when rating it. This is a really good game to have on a handheld. In many ways, Mario Kart is at its best on a handheld console. In a way, you have to look at this from two ways. As a third step in the step-by-step progress of Mario Kart games, it was definitely a step backwards, but it was also the very first Mario Kart game to be on a handheld, and in many ways the games went from strength to strength in handheld consoles going forward. I think it's quite fitting that it ranks so lowly in the Mario Kart games. However, given how successful they all are, that's not really a criticism. Mario Kart Super Circuit is still a very fun and enjoyable game to play, and it controls far better than the original. So if you like this retro version of it, I think it's easily deserving of a 7.5 out of 10. It's still fun to play, and as long as you don't mind the lack of innovation, go and have some fun with it. But what do you think? Comment below and let me know, and until next time, take the high ground.